What's going on, guys? Dottz here, and today I'm bringing you a beginner guide to the Warhammer in New World, discussing its different skill trees, its active abilities, its passive abilities, its scaling, and some basic tips and tricks about the weapon. So the first thing to talk about is the stat that the Warhammer scales with, and that is going to be strength. It does not have secondary scaling with any other stat. It only does scale with strength. Granted, if it does have a gem on it, you can gem it to scale with other stats such as intelligence, but in terms of the base stats, it does only scale with strength. In terms of damage type, as well as light and heavy attack damage, the weapon deals strike type damage, and in terms of the damage amount that it deals for its attacks, it deals 100% damage for the light attack, 130% for heavies, but for fully charged heavies, it deals 170%, which is an extremely high amount. And you're going to notice when we go into the Juggernaut tree, which is the DPS focus tree of the weapon, that a lot of the passives are focused around augmenting those charged heavy attacks. Now, like I said, we do have two trees for the Warhammer, and that is going to be the Juggernaut line and the Crowd Crusher. Juggernaut's focused a bit more on damage dealing, while Crowd Crusher is going to be focused more on crowd control as well as tankiness. Now, moving into our first active skill, we are going to have Armor Breaker. So Armor Breaker is a powerful swing that penetrates 35% of the target's armor and deals 140% weapon damage on an 11-second cooldown. This is a really good skill for dealing extra damage to heavy armored targets because it does penetrate through a significant amount of the armor. Once you also augment this ability with its relevant passives, you get Grit on the attack. You also get Rend for another 15% armor penetration, and then you also get increased damage against targets with 15% health, making it a really good attack to open with when you are fighting against enemies. The second active that we have is Mighty Gavel. This does an overhead leap attack that crushes down on enemies, dealing 160% weapon damage. Now, as we invest more points into this ability's passives, it also essentially does become an execute and does some extra stamina type damage. Personally, I'm not really the biggest fan of Mighty Gavel. I feel like the animation's a bit long, and even though the damage seems like, based on the numbers, like it would be high, it just felt like a very underwhelming skill to use. And personally, if I'm going to be going for a purely offensive damage typed weapon that I'm looking to deal big damage and execute targets, there are other weapons that I would prefer over the Warhammer, to be honest. And so for me, this really isn't a skill that I'm that big of a fan of. The third skill is going to be Wrecking Ball. I do like this one a lot. This does, you strike the ground at a target, dealing 120% damage and flattening them, which is very similar to a knockdown. But what's really good about this too is that when you use this weapon ability with its passives, once you do get those, you gain 20% Fortify for 4 seconds, which is a very large amount. And then you also flatten enemies within a 1.5 meter radius of the original target, making this essentially a small AoE knockdown, which I do think is fantastic. It deals a respectable amount of damage, knocks targets down, and sets them up to take some extra damage. Now, in terms of notable passives from the Juggernaut skill line, Epitome of Bonk is a really good one. I can't believe I just said epitome. By giving us another 10% armor penetration for our Warhammer attacks, just letting us get through our target's armor even more. But then we have a bunch of them that augment heavy attacks, like I did mention earlier. We have Hammer Time, which gives us a 20% in power on heavy attacks. We also have Hardened Steel, giving us Grit as well as damage reduction on heavy attacks. Grit will be staggered resistance, in case you do not know what that is. We also have Contemption, which gives us an extra 15% heavy attack damage done on targets below 30% health. And then we also have Quick Recovery to reduce cooldowns by 7% with heavy attacks. So, you know, focusing on these heavy attacks through the Juggernaut line will give us a lot of damage, and then a ton of additional bonuses from these passives. In terms of the main passive for this is called Justice for All. So if you press basic attack during Mighty Gavel, you can add a second attack that deals 200% weapon damage, but this only applies to Mighty Gavel, and this would make this ability pretty solid. But I'm gonna be honest, I still just think that there are other things from the Warhammer that are a little bit better to use as opposed to going for this, but that is just my opinion. Now, going into our Crowd Crusher line, our first ability is going to be Shockwave. Now, this is when you slam the hammer down on the ground, causing a 3 meter radius AoE that deals 80% weapon damage and applies stun to all impacted for 2 seconds. And if you're a tank with a Carnelian gem in the hammer, this will also also taunt. So this is going to be a really good skill to use if you want to tank with the Warhammer on that back bar. So this will cause a 6-second taunt on all enemies that gets hit with this ability. This ability is really, really good for, obviously, for CC, but on top of that, you also get some really solid debuffs from it with Weaken for 10% damage reduction on your opponent, so they deal 10% less damage for 10 seconds. And then you also have Meteoric Crater, which will expand that Shockwave AoE to 4 meters, making it quite a nice AoE stun. Our second ability is going to be Clear Out. Now, Clear Out is a wide swing that knocks enemies back for 4 meters to create distance and deals 115% weapon damage. Overall, I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of this skill, but it does have its application specifically in wars where you're able to knock people out of points, because at the end of the day, wars are focused around holding a point. So if you can knock opponents out of that AoE so that they're no longer standing in it, that's a really good thing that you can do. It also does give Fortify for you and allies for a 10% defense bonus for 4 seconds. So this will also be really good if you're tanking, want to knock some enemies back, and also give your allies Fortify. And so it's a really solid ability. Our third one is going to be Path of Destiny. So Path of Destiny is a powerful ground strike that erupts a linear wave of energy in front of the player, dealing 110% weapon damage to all targets in his path. So this is like a small ranged ability that the Warhammer does have, where you just smash it on the ground and some small AoE patches appear in front of you and deal damage to your opponents. And Seismic Wave, which is one of the passes from this, will also cause all enemies to be staggered. And then if you do hit multiple enemies with this from Stimulated Reduction, the second passive, you will be reducing the cooldown of this ability. Now, in terms of some notable passes from the Crowd Crusher skill line, I recommend there's 3 main ones that I really like. Outnumbered is a really good one. Increased damage absorption by 10% if surrounded by 2 or more enemies within 3 meters. This is great for tanking, or again, that frontline unit in the war where you're just in there crowd controlling people, CCing people. This is a really good passive for that. We also do have Concussive Impact. You do 15% damage against targets affected by Warhammer debuffs. Warhammer applies a ton of debuffs, so this is just a really easy way to get a flat 15% damage increase. And then the final passive that I really do like is Prevailing Spirit. Regain 35% damage dealt as health when using a Crowd Crusher ability. This is a nice heal to get, you know, especially since a lot of these abilities that we have from the Warhammer are AoE. So we're able to get a good amount of health back when using our crowd crushing abilities, which I do really enjoy. And then the final passive is extremely good for PvP Aftershock. When a target is affected by a crowd control effect, they are slowed by 20% for 4 seconds. You know, slows are going to be really potent, and just CC in general is obviously very potent in PvP. So being able to slow your targets for a decent amount of time after they are crowd controlled from your various crowd crusher abilities is going to be a very valuable thing, and allow you to basically set up your enemies with these CCs to just be taken down by all of your allies. And this is going to keep everybody nice and held in, because you can combine this really well with other abilities such as like the vacuum from the Great Axe in order to create these nice AoE just areas where no one can really escape. And speaking of which, it's going to transition us really well into some tips and what other weapons and armors I would pair with this. So personally, there's only really 2 weapons that I would like to pair with the Warhammer myself, and that is going to be the Great Axe as well as the Sword and Shield. I feel like the Great Axe and the Warhammer combine really well together. The Great Axe gives a lot of damage from its passives, and there's a lot of damage baked into the light and heavy attacks. You also do have a lot of gap closing ability with being able to hold targets close, between Reap being able to pull targets in, as well as Charge being able to chase targets down. And then you also have the Vacuum with Gravity Well to keep people in place. The thing with the Warhammer is it's a very slow weapon, so having something with a lot of chase like Great Axe, also having Bloodlust to move 30% faster while moving towards enemies, is just going to be a really good thing. And plus, the Great Axe does deal quite a bit of damage, and so being able to pair the Warhammer and Great Axe together is really good. Tons of AoE pressure, tons of AoE lockdown, and you're able to, you know, these 2 weapons combine really well together in a war, and it's going to be one of your staple frontline weapon combinations for wars. Now, on the PvE side of things, or if you are playing a tank in PvP, the Sword and Shield is going to be a good pair with it, mainly because if you pair the sword and shield and all the crowd control it has from the defender and all the tankiness from defender, as well as with the crowd crushing skill line from the Warhammer, you are going to be just a tanky boy with a lot of crowd control and lockdown capability. Granted, you're going to probably want to grab a gap closer from the sword and shield, such as shield rush or leaping strike. Otherwise, you're going to be very easily kited, but those weapons will combine extremely well together to allow you to chase down and lock down opponents to set up your allies to deal that damage. And remember, if you do want to use the Warhammer for tanking and PvE, you're going to need to make sure you do grab Shockwave, since that is the only taunt ability from the Warhammer. But for tanking, I do recommend mostly looking into the Crowd Crusher line, while if you're going to be PvPing with this and pairing it with the Great Axe, I personally would recommend focusing on mainly Shockwave and Path of Destiny. I think those are going to be really good, and then pairing it with another crowd control from this, such as either Wrecking Ball or Clear Out, would be a really good way to kind of round out the weapon line. Now, in terms of armor types, I would always recommend going in heavy armor personally. With the Warhammer, you are an upfront unit, you are in the fray, and so you are going to want to have the damage mitigation from heavy armor in order to make yourself not just flop in one hit, especially if you're pairing it with a second melee weapon, like again that sword and shield or Great Axe. You're gonna be tanking some hits, and so I think that giving you the most mitigation from heavy armor, as well as also having the increased crowd control duration, that extra 20% from the heavy armor, is going to be really good, because again, that Warhammer is so focused around CCs. Being able to increase those by another 20% is going to be a very good thing. But guys, with that being said, that is going to be it for me today on my Warhammer Beginner's Guide. Hopefully you guys did find this helpful, and if you did, I appreciate it if you smacked a like on it. It really does help me with that YouTube algorithm. And if you guys have any questions about the Warhammer, let me know below. And guys, I also want to see in the comments below, what is your favorite weapon to pair the Warhammer with? Are you like me, and do you like to pair it with the sword and shield or the Great Axe, or do you have another weapon you want to pair it with? Let me know in those comments below so others can maybe get some ideas for their own builds. And then if you guys want to see more New World and other MMORPG content, feel free to hit that sub button, as well as hit the bell to keep those notifications on so you never miss an upload. Appreciate you all stopping by today. Thank you so much for spending some time. As always, I'm Dottz Gaming, and I'll see you all in the next video.